I never thought my 30th birthday would be the day that changed everything. Looking back, I should have seen the signs, but hindsight has a way of making fools of us all. My name's Sarah, and this is the story of how a simple celebration turned into a nightmare that would reshape my entire life. It was a warm Saturday evening in June, and our modest suburban home in Oakville, just outside of Toronto, was buzzing with activity. I'd spent the entire week preparing for this party, determined to make it perfect. My husband, Evan, had promised to handle the guest list and coordinate with his family, which should have been my first red flag. Evan's family had always been a bit intense, especially his mother, Diana. As I stood in our kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a platter of veggie sticks and hummus, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The house looked amazing, with soft fairy lights twinkling in the backyard and the sweet scent of lavender candles filling the air. I'd even managed to convince Evan to help me set up a small bar area in the corner of the living room, complete with a selection of local craft beers and wines. "Sarah, honey, the first guests are here," Evan called from the front door. I smoothed down my new blue dress, a splurge I'd justified as a birthday treat to myself, and headed out to greet our friends. The party started off wonderfully. Our close friends, Mike and Lisa, arrived with their kids in tow, followed closely by my colleague, Jen, and her husband. Soon, the house was filled with the warm chatter of conversation and laughter. I mingled, accepting birthday wishes and compliments on the party setup, all while keeping a watchful eye on the food table. You see, I have severe allergies: shellfish, nuts, and strawberries. It's been a part of my life for as long as I can remember, and everyone who knows me is aware of how serious it is. Years ago, at a family dinner shortly after Evan and I started dating, I had a close call with a salad that had been tossed with a dressing containing cashew oil. The memory of that night, the terror in Evan's eyes as he fumbled for my EpiPen, the rush to the emergency room, was something I never wanted to relive. As more guests arrived, including Evan's family, I felt a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. Diana swept in, all perfume and air kisses, her husband Tom following behind with a tight smile. "Happy birthday, darling," Diana trilled, handing me a gift bag. "I hope you don't mind, but I just had to bring a few of my special dishes. You know how I love to cook." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the alarm bells ringing in my head. "That's so thoughtful, Diana. But you know about my allergies, right? I'm sure Evan mentioned." "Oh, pish posh," she interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "Don't you worry your pretty little head. I made everything specially for you. No shellfish, no nuts, no strawberries. I promise." I wanted to believe her, I really did. But there was something in her eyes, a mischievous glint that made me uneasy. Still, I didn't want to cause a scene or seem ungrateful, so I thanked her and watched as she bustled off to the kitchen to arrange her dishes on the buffet table. The evening progressed, and I found myself relaxing a bit. The food looked amazing, and everyone seemed to be having a great time. Evan was in his element, telling jokes and keeping everyone's glasses full. I was in the middle of a conversation with Lisa about her recent promotion when Diana appeared at my elbow, holding a plate piled high with what looked like some sort of pasta salad. "Sarah, darling, you simply must try this," she insisted, her voice syrupy sweet. "It's a special family recipe, passed down from my grandmother. I made it just for you." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to be careful. But Diana's eyes were locked on mine, challenging me, and I felt the weight of the entire party's attention. Evan appeared behind his mother, grinning widely. "Go on, babe," he encouraged. "Mom's been talking about this dish all week." Slowly, I took the plate from Diana's hands. The pasta looked harmless enough, spiral noodles tossed with what appeared to be a creamy sauce, flecks of herbs visible throughout. I couldn't smell anything alarming, and Diana was nodding encouragingly. "I promise, it's safe," she said with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. Taking a deep breath, I lifted a forkful to my mouth and took a bite. The flavor was surprisingly good, tangy and rich, with a hint of something I couldn't quite place. For a moment, I felt relieved. Maybe I had been paranoid after all. But then, it hit me. A familiar itch began to spread across my throat, and my chest tightened as if someone had wrapped an invisible band around it. Panic surged through me as I realized what was happening. I dropped the plate, barely registering the sound of shattering ceramic as it hit the floor. "Evan," I gasped, my voice already growing hoarse. "EpiPen, now." The room erupted into chaos. Guests scrambled back, looks of horror dawning on their faces as they realized what was happening. Evan stood frozen for a moment before springing into action, racing towards our bedroom where we kept my emergency medication. I could feel my skin prickling with heat, hives beginning to form. My vision blurred, and I stumbled, knocking into the coffee table. Strong arms caught me. "Mike," I think, lowering me gently to the floor. I could hear Lisa's voice, sharp with fear, telling someone to call an ambulance. Through the haze of panic and increasing difficulty breathing, I saw Diana. She stood apart from the commotion, arms crossed over her chest, an expression of what looked almost like satisfaction on her face. "It was just a joke," I heard her mutter. "She's overreacting." The room was spinning now, faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of concerned expressions. Where was Evan with the EpiPen? I tried to call out for him, but my throat was closing up, each attempt at drawing breath more difficult than the last. Just as black spots began to dance at the edges of my vision, Evan reappeared, EpiPen in hand. I felt the sharp jab in my thigh, heard the click of the auto-injector, and waited for the epinephrine to take effect. The relief wasn't immediate, but I could feel my airways beginning to open up again. Distantly, I heard sirens approaching. Jen was kneeling beside me, her hand cool against my feverish skin as she murmured words of comfort. I wanted to thank her, to reassure everyone that I was going to be okay, but I couldn't find the strength to speak. As the paramedics burst through the front door, I caught one last glimpse of Diana. She was speaking urgently to Evan, her hand on his arm. Even through my fading consciousness, I could see the conflict on my husband's face. And then, darkness claimed me, Diana's laughter ringing in my ears like a twisted lullaby. The last coherent thought I had before succumbing to unconsciousness was a mix of disbelief and betrayal. How could this have happened? How could my own family, because that's what I had thought Diana was, put me in danger like this? As the paramedics lifted me onto a stretcher, those questions echoed in my mind, unanswered and terrifying in their implications. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The events of that night would set in motion a chain of revelations and confrontations that would test my relationships, my resolve, and ultimately, my sense of self. But in that moment, as I was rushed to the hospital, all I could focus on was the simple act of breathing, grateful for each shallow, painful inhale that meant I was still alive. The birthday party that was supposed to mark a joyous milestone in my life had instead become a turning point of a different kind. As the ambulance sped through the streets of Oakville, sirens wailing, I couldn't have imagined how this one event would unravel the fabric of my life, exposing truths I wasn't prepared to face and strengths I didn't know I possessed. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with difficult decisions and painful realizations. But sometimes, it takes a near-death experience to truly start living. The first thing I became aware of was the steady, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. As I slowly regained consciousness, the sterile smell of antiseptics filled my nostrils, a stark contrast to the warm, homey sense of my birthday party. My eyes fluttered open, squinting against the harsh fluorescent lights of what I quickly realized was a hospital room. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, unresponsive. And 4 lines snaked from my arm to a bag of clear fluid hanging beside the bed. The simple act of breathing felt like a monumental task, each inhale accompanied by a dull ache in my chest. As the fog of unconsciousness lifted, the memories of what had happened came rushing back with brutal clarity. A gentle touch on my arm startled me. "Ms. Thompson," a soft voice said. I turned my head slightly to see a nurse standing beside my bed, her kind eyes crinkling with concern. "I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling?" I opened my mouth to respond, but my throat felt raw, and all that came out was a weak croak. The nurse quickly offered me a small cup of water with a straw, which I sipped gratefully. What happened?" I managed to whisper after a moment. The nurse's expression turned serious. "You suffered a severe allergic reaction, Ms. Thompson. The paramedics arrived just in time to administer epinephrine. You've been unconscious for about 6 hours." She paused, allowing me to process this information. Do you remember what might have triggered the reaction? The memory of Diana's smug expression as she handed me that plate of pasta flashed through my mind, followed quickly by the realization of what she had done. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I closed my eyes, fighting back tears of anger and betrayal. My mother-in-law, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She put something in the food. She knew about my allergies. The nurse's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but she quickly schooled her features back into a professional mask. I see, she said carefully. Ms. Thompson, I need to inform you that in cases like these, we're required to report suspected intentional harm to the authorities. Would you like me to do that? I hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. On one hand, the thought of causing a rift in the family was terrifying. On the other, Diana's actions could have killed me. Before I could respond, a commotion in the hallway caught my attention. I need to see my wife. Evan's voice, tinged with panic and frustration, carried through the partially open door. A moment later, he burst into the room, looking disheveled and wild-eyed. When he saw me awake, relief washed over his features. Sarah, oh thank God, he breathed, rushing to my bedside. The nurse glanced between us, then quietly excused herself, promising to return shortly with the doctor. As soon as the door closed behind her, Evan collapsed into the chair beside my bed, grasping my hand in both of his. I was so scared, he said, his voice thick with emotion. When you collapsed, I thought I was going to lose you. I wanted to feel comforted by his presence, to lose myself in the familiar warmth of his touch. But all I could think about was Diana's satisfied smirk as I struggled to breathe on our living room floor. Evan, I said, my voice stronger now, edged with steel. Your mother tried to kill me. Evan's grip on my hand loosened, and he leaned back slightly, an expression I couldn't quite read flitting across his face. Sarah, honey, you don't mean that, he said, his tone placating. Mom would never, it was just a misunderstanding. You know how she is, always trying to lighten the mood with her jokes. I stared at him in disbelief, anger bubbling up inside me. A joke? Evan, I could have died. She deliberately put something in that food, knowing full well about my allergies. How can you defend her? Evan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I'd seen 1,000 times when he was stressed. Look, I'm not defending what happened. It was stupid and reckless. But Mom, she's not a bad person. She just doesn't always think things through. We can talk to her, make her understand how serious this was. I pulled my hand away from his, ignoring the hurt look that flashed across his face. Evan, listen to yourself. This wasn't some harmless prank. This was deliberate, calculated harm. Your mother could be facing criminal charges for this. At the mention of criminal charges, Evan's expression hardened. Criminal charges? Sarah, you can't be serious. Think about what that would do to the family, to my dad, to our relationships with everyone. There has to be another way to handle this. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, and a middle-aged man in a white coat entered, followed by the nurse from earlier. Ms. Thompson, I'm Dr. Patel, he said, his voice warm but professional. I'm glad to see you're awake. How are you feeling? Over the next few minutes, Dr. Patel examined me thoroughly, explaining that while the epinephrine had counteracted the worst of the allergic reaction, I wasn't out of the woods yet. Anaphylaxis can sometimes have a biphasic response, he explained, which means symptoms can return hours after the initial reaction. We'll need to keep you here for observation for at least 24 hours. As Dr. Patel spoke, I could see Evan growing increasingly agitated. When the doctor mentioned the possibility of involving the police due to the circumstances of my reaction, Evan interrupted. That won't be necessary, he said quickly. It was just a misunderstanding. We'll handle it as a family. Dr. Patel raised an eyebrow, looking between Evan and me. Mr. Thompson, I understand this is a difficult situation, but your wife's life was in serious danger. It's important that. I said we'll handle it, Evan snapped, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard him speak to a stranger. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor. After a moment, Dr. Patel cleared his throat. Well, the decision ultimately rests with Ms. Thompson. For now, let's focus on your recovery, he said, turning back to me. The nurse will be checking on you regularly. If you experience any difficulty breathing, increased swelling, or any other concerning symptoms, please don't hesitate to use the call button immediately. As Dr. Patel and the nurse left the room, the tension between Evan and me was palpable. I closed my eyes, suddenly exhausted by more than just the physical ordeal I'd been through. When I opened them again, Evan was staring out the window, his jaw clenched tightly. Evan, I said softly, we need to talk about this. About what your mother did, about how we're going to handle it. He turned back to me, and the look in his eyes made my heart sink. It wasn't the loving, supportive gaze of the man I thought I'd married. Instead, I saw fear, defensiveness, and something else I couldn't quite place. There's nothing to talk about, he said firmly. It was a mistake. Mom feels terrible. When you're feeling better, we'll all sit down together and sort this out. As a family. The way he emphasized family felt like a slap in the face. In that moment, I realized with startling clarity that in Evan's mind, I wasn't really part of that family. Not in the way that mattered when push came to shove. I think you should go, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the turmoil inside me. I need to rest, and I have a lot to think about. Evan looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. He leaned down to kiss my forehead, and I had to resist the urge to flinch away. I'll be back first thing in the morning, he promised. Try to get some sleep. Everything will look better in the daylight. As the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The enormity of what had happened, not just the allergic reaction, but the betrayal it represented, crashed over me like a tidal wave. Tears that I'd been holding back since I regained consciousness finally spilled over, and I sobbed quietly into my pillow. The nurse came in a few times during the night to check on me, each time offering a sympathetic smile and a gentle pat on the arm. As the hours ticked by, marked by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the muffled sounds of a hospital at night, I found myself at a crossroads. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my place in the family I'd married into, had been called into question. As dawn broke, painting the Toronto skyline visible from my window in hues of pink and gold, I made a decision. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: things could never go back to the way they were before. The Sarah who had blithely accepted a plate of food from her mother-in-law at a birthday party was gone. In her place was a woman who had stared death in the face and come out the other side, changed, shaken, but determined to stand up for herself, no matter the cost. Little did I know, the challenges that lay ahead would test that determination in ways I could never have imagined. But as I watched the sun rise over the city, I felt a glimmer of strength growing inside me. Whatever came next, I would face it head-on, armed with the knowledge that I was stronger than anyone, including myself, had ever given me credit for. The drive home from the hospital was tense, to say the least. Evan kept his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I stared out the passenger window, watching the familiar streets of Oakville pass by in a blur. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words and simmering emotions. As we pulled into our driveway, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The last time I'd seen our house, it had been full of life and laughter. Now, it loomed before me like a haunted mansion, holding memories I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Evan cut the engine and turned to me, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft but strained, "I know you're upset, but please, can we just try to move past this? Mom's waiting inside. She wants to apologize." I stared at him in disbelief. "Move past this? Evan, I nearly died. Your mother deliberately put my life at risk, and you want me to just, what? Forgive and forget?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now only irritated me. "I'm not saying forget, but she's family, Sarah. We have to find a way to work this out." Without responding, I pushed open the car door and stepped out. The summer air, usually so refreshing, felt oppressive. As I walked toward the front door, I could hear muffled voices inside. Evan hurried to catch up, unlocking the door and ushering me in. The moment I stepped into our living room, I froze. The party decorations were still up, a mockery of the celebration that had gone so horribly wrong. Balloons sagged listlessly, and the banner proclaiming Happy 30th birthday, Sarah, seemed to taunt me from its place above the fireplace. And there, sitting on our couch with a glass of wine in hand, was Diana. She looked up as we entered, her face a mask of contrition that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sarah, darling," she said, rising to her feet. "I'm so glad you're home. I've been sick with worry." I took an involuntary step back, bumping into Evan, who had come in behind me. Diana's presence in our home, acting as if she had every right to be there after what she'd done, made my blood boil. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Diana had the audacity to look hurt. I wanted to apologize, of course. What happened at the party, it was a terrible mistake. I never meant for things to go so far. I felt Evan's hand on my shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting but which only served to heighten my sense of being cornered. "See, honey," he said. "Mom knows she messed up. Can't we just talk this out?" Something inside me snapped. All the fear, anger, and betrayal I'd been holding back since waking up in the hospital came rushing to the surface. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice rising. "You call deliberately serving me food you knew I was allergic to a mistake?" Diana's expression hardened slightly. "Now, Sarah, let's not be dramatic. It was a joke that went too far, that's all. I didn't think you'd react so strongly." "Not be dramatic?" I was almost shouting now. I could have died, Diana. Do you understand that? If the ambulance hadn't arrived when it did, I might not be standing here right now. "Oh, please," Diana scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "You're young and healthy. A little allergic reaction isn't going to kill you." I stared at her, momentarily struck speechless by her callousness. Evan stepped between us, his face a picture of distress. "Come on, both of you. This isn't helping." "Mom, maybe you should." "No," I interrupted, finding my voice again. "I want to hear this. I want to hear exactly why you thought it was okay to put my life at risk, Diana. Was it funny to you, watching me struggle to breathe? Did you enjoy seeing me collapse on the floor of my own home?" Diana's facade of remorse crumbled entirely. She set her wine glass down with a sharp clink and fixed me with a cold stare. "You want the truth? Fine. I'm tired of walking on eggshells around you, Sarah. Always having to cater to your special needs. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to plan family gatherings around your allergies? How many recipes I've had to change, how many traditions we've had to alter because you can't handle a little shellfish or nuts?" I felt as if I'd been slapped. "My allergies aren't a choice, Diana. They're a medical condition that could kill me if not taken seriously." "Oh, grow up," Diana snapped. "The world doesn't revolve around you and your problems. I raised 2 boys without any of this fuss. In my day, we didn't have all these allergies and special diets. We ate what was put in front of us and were grateful for it." Evan, who had been glancing nervously between us, finally spoke up. "Mom, that's enough. Sarah's allergies are serious. You saw what happened at the party." Diana rounded on him. "Don't you start." I was trying to teach her a lesson, to show her that she's been overreacting all this time. How was I supposed to know she'd make such a scene? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The realization that Diana had intentionally tried to trigger my allergies, not as a misguided joke but as some sort of twisted lesson, made me feel physically ill. "I want you out of my house," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Now." Diana laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "Your house? Oh, sweetheart. This is my son's house. I was coming here long before you entered the picture, and I'll be here long after you're gone." I turned to Evan, expecting, hoping to see him ready to defend me, to stand up to his mother. Instead, I saw conflict and uncertainty in his eyes. "Evan," I said, hating how small and unsure my voice sounded. He looked between his mother and me, visibly torn. "Sarah, honey, let's all just calm down. Mom didn't mean..." "Didn't mean what, Evan?" I cut him off. "Didn't mean to nearly kill me. Didn't mean to admit that she's been resenting me for years over something I can't control. What exactly didn't she mean?" Diana smirked, clearly sensing her son's hesitation. "You see, Evan, this is what I've been telling you. She's too sensitive, too demanding. Always playing the victim." Something inside me hardened at those words. I realized, with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying, that I was alone in this. Evan wasn't going to choose me over his mother. He never had, and he never would. "I'm calling the police," I said, reaching for my phone. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Diana's smug expression faltered, and Evan's eyes widened in panic. "Sarah, no," he exclaimed, reaching for my arm. "You can't do that. Think about what it would do to the family." I yanked my arm away from him. "Family? What family, Evan? The one that tries to poison me? The one that stands by and watches it happen?" Diana stood up, her face pale. "Now, let's not be hasty. There's no need to involve the authorities in a family matter. This stopped being just a family matter when you decided to use my allergies as a weapon," I retorted, my finger hovering over the emergency call button. Evan moved between me and the door, his expression pleading. "Sarah, please. We can work this out. Just put the phone down, okay? Let's talk about this rationally." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the man I thought I'd married. This was someone who would always put his mother's wishes above my safety, my well-being. "Move, Evan," I said quietly. "Sarah, think about what you're doing," he urged. "Where will you go? You can't afford to live on your own. Your job barely covers your student loans. You need us." His words hit me like a physical blow. Not because they were true, though part of me feared they might be, but because of what they revealed. Evan saw our relationship, saw me, as a transaction. A dependent. Not a partner. In that moment, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I hit the call button. 911, "What's your emergency?" a calm voice answered. Diana lunged forward, trying to grab the phone from my hand, but I dodged her grasp. "I need to report an intentional act of harm," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My mother-in-law deliberately exposed me to allergens, causing a severe reaction that required hospitalization." As I spoke to the dispatcher, giving our address and the details of what had happened, I watched the scene before me unfold as if I were outside my body. Diana's face contorted with rage and fear, her composure finally cracking completely. Evan alternated between trying to reason with me and attempting to placate his mother. When I ended the call, the room fell into a tense silence. Diana was the first to break it. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "I'll make sure you never see a penny of the family money. You'll be out on the street before you know it." I met her gaze steadily. I'd rather be on the street than spend another day pretending to be part of this toxic family. Evan made one last attempt. "Sarah, please. We can still fix this. Just tell the police it was a misunderstanding when they arrive." I looked at him, feeling a mix of pity and disappointment. "No, Evan. We can't fix this. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together." As we waited for the police to arrive, I stood by the window, watching our quiet suburban street. Cars passed by, neighbors walked their dogs, all oblivious to the drama unfolding in our living room. I thought about how, just days ago, I had been one of them, going about my life, blind to the undercurrents of resentment and manipulation that had been swirling around me. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through my thoughts. As they grew louder, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I was done being a victim. Whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The police car pulled into our driveway, and I took a deep breath. This was it. The point of no return. As I moved to open the door, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who had excitedly prepared for her birthday party just days ago. She looked tired, yes, but also stronger. Determined. I opened the door to greet the officers, ready to tell my story and face whatever consequences came with it. The life I had known was over, but as I stood on the threshold of my home, I realized that maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a bad thing after all. The sound of the doorbell ringing felt surreal, cutting through the tense silence that had fallen over the living room. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. As I moved to answer the door, I could feel Evan and Diana's eyes boring into my back, a mixture of disbelief and anger radiating from them. I opened the door to find 2 police officers standing on our front porch. The summer evening had cooled, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass from our neighbor's yard. It felt strange, almost wrong, that the world outside could be so normal when everything inside had fallen apart. "Good evening, the older of the 2 officers said, his voice calm and professional. "I'm Officer Thompson, and this is Officer Chen. We received a call about an incident at this address. May we come in?" I nodded, stepping aside to let them enter. As they walked into the living room, I saw Officer Chen's eyes sweep over the scene, the sagging party decorations, Diana's half-empty wine glass on the coffee table, Evan's tense posture as he stood by the fireplace. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, taking in my hospital bracelet and the way I held myself, still sore from the ordeal. "I'm the one who called," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "My name is Sarah Thompson. I'd like to report an intentional act of harm against me." Officer Thompson nodded, pulling out a small notebook. "Can you tell us what happened, Mrs. Thompson?" I took a deep breath and began to recount the events of my birthday party. As I spoke, I could see Diana's face growing paler, her usual composure cracking under the weight of my words. Evan kept trying to interject, but Officer Chen gently but firmly asked him to let me finish. When I got to the part about waking up in the hospital, my voice faltered for a moment. "The doctors said, they said if the ambulance had arrived even a few minutes later, I might not have made it." Officer Thompson's expression remained neutral, but I saw a flicker of something, concern, maybe even anger, in his eyes. "And you believe this was an intentional act?" he asked. Before I could respond, Diana burst out, "This is ridiculous. It was a joke, a silly prank that went too far. I never meant to hurt anyone." Officer Chen turned to her, her voice cool and professional. "And you are Diana Thompson," she said, drawing herself up with as much dignity as she could muster. "I'm Evan's mother. This whole thing has been blown completely out of proportion." Evan stepped forward, his face a mask of anxiety. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. My mother would never intentionally harm Sarah. Can't we just talk this out as a family?" I felt a surge of frustration at Evan's words. Even now, with the police involved, he was trying to downplay what had happened. "There's no misunderstanding," I said firmly. "Diana knew about my allergies. She deliberately put something in my food, knowing it could harm me." Officer Thompson turned back to Diana. "Is this true, Did you knowingly serve Mrs. Thompson food containing allergens?" Diana's composure finally cracked completely. "Oh, for heaven's sake. Yes, I put a bit of cashew paste in the sauce. But it was just to prove a point. She's always going on about her allergies, making everyone cater to her special needs. I wanted to show her she was overreacting." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Diana's admission hanging in the air. I saw shock register on Evan's face, as if he was finally realizing the full extent of what his mother had done. Officer Chen's voice was sharp when she spoke. You do realize that what you're describing is a criminal act. Intentionally exposing someone to a known allergen can be classified as assault, possibly even attempted murder depending on the severity of the reaction." Diana paled further, her earlier bravado evaporating. "Attempted murder? But that's absurd. I never meant to. I didn't think." "That's precisely the problem," I interjected, unable to contain myself any longer. "You didn't think about the consequences of your actions. You didn't think about how it would feel for me to fight for breath on my own living room floor. You didn't think about what would happen to Evan if I had died." At the mention of Evan's name, all eyes in the room turned to him. He stood there, looking lost and conflicted. I didn't know," he said weakly. "Mom, how could you do this?" Officer Thompson cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, were you aware of your mother's intentions before the incident?" Evan shook his head vehemently. "No, of course not. I would never have allowed it if I'd known." But even as he spoke, a memory flashed through my mind, Evan's knowing smile as Diana handed me the plate, the way he'd encouraged me to try the dish. Had he really been completely unaware? Or had he known something was up, even if he hadn't known the full extent of his mother's plans? Officer Chen must have picked up on my doubt because she asked, "Mrs. Thompson, do you have any reason to believe your husband might have been involved in planning this prank?" I hesitated, torn between my lingering feelings for Evan and the growing suspicion that he wasn't as innocent as he claimed. I'm not sure, I admitted. He encouraged me to eat the food Diana prepared, even though he knows how careful I usually am about my allergies. Evan's face crumpled. "Sarah, no. You can't think I would ever. I love you. I would never intentionally put you in danger." But his words rang hollow. Love, I was realizing, wasn't just about grand gestures or saying the right things. It was about respect, about putting your partner's well-being above all else. And Evan, for all his protestations of love, had failed to do that time and time again. Officer Thompson turned to Diana. I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to come down to the station for further questioning. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As Officer Chen began to read Diana her rights, I watched Evan's face. He looked shell-shocked, as if his entire world was crumbling around him. In a way, I supposed it was. The carefully constructed facade of his perfect family was finally falling apart. "What happens now?" I asked Officer Thompson quietly. He gave me a sympathetic look. "We'll need to take formal statements from all of you. There will likely be an investigation, and if the district attorney decides to press charges, this could go to court. Do you have somewhere safe you can stay tonight, Mrs. Thompson? Given the circumstances, it might be best if you weren't in the same house as your husband or mother-in-law for the time being." The reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. This was really happening. I was pressing charges against my mother-in-law, potentially ending my marriage in the process. Where would I go? What would I do? As if reading my thoughts, Officer Chen spoke up. "If you need help finding a safe place to stay, we can put you in touch with some local organizations that assist victims of domestic incidents." Victim. The word echoed in my mind. Is that what I was now? A victim? No, I decided. I was a survivor. I had faced death and come out the other side, and I wasn't about to let anyone, not Diana, not Evan, not anyone, make me feel powerless again. "Thank you," I said to Officer Chen. I think that might be a good idea." As Diana was escorted out to the police car, her earlier bravado completely gone, Evan made one last plea. "Sarah, please. We can work this out. Don't do this to our family." I looked at him, really looked at him, and felt a mixture of sadness and resolve wash over me. "Our family, Evan? The one where your mother tries to poison me and you stand by and let it happen? That's not a family I want to be part of anymore." Officer Thompson gently intervened. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. Your wife has made it clear she doesn't feel safe here, and we need to respect that." As I gathered a few essential belongings, my mind was racing. What would tomorrow bring? How would I rebuild my life from here? The future stretched out before me, uncertain and scary, but also full of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Before leaving, I took one last look around the house that had been my home for the past 5 years. The birthday decorations, now sad and deflated, seemed like a fitting metaphor for my marriage. What I had thought was a celebration of love and family had turned out to be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. As I walked out the front door, a cool evening breeze washed over me. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt like I could breathe freely. The road ahead would be difficult, I knew that. There would be legal battles, financial struggles, and the emotional toll of unraveling a life I had spent years building. But as I climbed into the back of Officer Chen's patrol car, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had survived the worst day of my life. I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. Whatever came next, I would face it with the same strength and determination that had gotten me this far. The car pulled away from the curb, and I watched my house, my old life, recede in the rearview mirror. As we turned the corner and it disappeared from view, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This wasn't an ending, I realized. It was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to seeing what the future held. The days following my departure from the house I once called home passed in a blur of police statements, legal consultations, and sleepless nights on a friend's pull-out couch. Lisa, my colleague from work, had generously offered me her spare room when she heard what happened. Her kindness was a beacon of light in the darkness that had engulfed my life. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the fateful birthday party, that I found myself sitting across from Detective Samantha Reyes at the Oakville police station. The detective's office was small but tidy, with a window overlooking the parking lot where raindrops raced down the glass, mirroring the tears I'd shed over the past week. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Reyes began, her voice gentle but firm, "I know you've been through a lot, but I need to ask you some more questions about your relationship with your mother-in-law, Diana. We're trying to establish a pattern of behavior that might help us understand her motives." I nodded, taking a sip of the lukewarm coffee she'd offered me. "What do you want to know? Can you think of any other incidents, prior to the birthday party, where Diana might have acted aggressively towards you or disregarded your well-being?" The question opened a floodgate of memories I'd long suppressed. As I began to speak, I felt like I was watching scenes from a movie I'd forgotten I'd starred in. "There was our wedding," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "Diana insisted on handling the catering. I specifically asked for a separate allergen-free section for the buffet, but when the day came, everything was mixed together. I ended up eating nothing but plain rice at my own wedding reception." Detective Reyes made a note, her brow furrowing. "Did you confront her about it?" I shook my head. Evan said she must have forgotten, that she was under a lot of stress with the wedding planning. He told me not to make a big deal out of it. As I continued to recount incident after incident, family dinners where Diana would forget about my allergies, snide comments about how inconvenient my dietary restrictions were, the time she'd sent me a birthday cake laced with strawberries, a pattern began to emerge. One that I'd been blind to for far too long. "Mrs. Thompson," Detective Reyes said, leaning forward, "based on what you're telling me, it seems like Diana's actions at your birthday party weren't an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of years of deliberate disregard for your health and safety." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd known, on some level, that Diana had never truly accepted me. But to hear it laid out so plainly, to see the intentionality behind her actions, was overwhelming. "But why?" I asked, more to myself than to the detective. "Why would she go to such lengths to hurt me?" Detective Reyes's expression softened. "Sometimes, people's motivations are complex. From what you've told me, it seems like Diana viewed you as a threat to her relationship with her son. Her actions might have been an attempt to assert control, to prove that she still had power in the family dynamic." As I processed this, a thought struck me. "Detective, is it possible, could Evan have known about this? About what his mother was planning?" The question had been gnawing at me since the night of the party. Evan's reaction, his immediate defense of his mother, had seemed off somehow. Detective Reyes nodded slowly. "We've been looking into that possibility," she admitted. "Mrs. Thompson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Have you checked your husband's phone or email accounts since the incident?" I shook my head, feeling a mix of confusion and dread. "No, I haven't had access to them." "Why?" Detective Reyes pulled out a folder from her desk drawer. "We obtained a warrant to search your husband's electronic communications. What we found, well, I think you should see for yourself." With trembling hands, I took the folder she offered. Inside were printouts of emails and text messages, all exchanges between Evan and Diana. As I read through them, I felt my world tilt on its axis once again. There, in black and white, was evidence of a conspiracy I could never have imagined. Evan hadn't just known about his mother's plan, he'd been an active participant. The messages detailed their scheme to teach me a lesson about my allergies, with Evan expressing frustration over how my dietary restrictions were ruining family gatherings and Diana suggesting ways to expose me to allergens without raising suspicion. I felt physically ill as I read message after message, each one revealing a depth of betrayal I hadn't thought possible. Evan, the man I'd loved and trusted, had been plotting with his mother to harm me. To prove some twisted point about my allergies being an inconvenience. Mrs. Thompson. Sarah, Detective Reyes said gently, I know this is a lot to take in. But I need you to understand the seriousness of what we're dealing with here. This wasn't just a prank gone wrong. This was a premeditated act that could have resulted in your death. I looked up from the papers, my vision blurred with tears. What happens now? We'll be bringing your husband in for questioning, she explained. Based on this evidence, he could be facing charges of conspiracy and aiding and abetting. As for Diana, the district attorney is considering upgrading the charges to attempted murder. The words attempted murder echoed in my head. It seemed surreal, like something out of a crime drama, not my real life. But the evidence was right there in front of me. I need some air, I managed to say, standing up on shaky legs. Detective Reyes nodded understandingly. Of course. Take all the time you need. Officer Chen will be outside if you need anything. I stumbled out of the office and down the hallway, eventually finding my way to a small courtyard behind the police station. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent in the air. I sat on a damp bench, my mind reeling from everything I'd just learned. As I sat there, pieces of the puzzle that had been my married life began to fall into place. The way Evan would always side with his mother in arguments. The subtle digs about my high-maintenance dietary needs. The pressure to loosen up about my allergies. It had all been building to this moment, this ultimate betrayal. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, when I felt a presence beside me. I looked up to see Officer Chen, the same officer who had responded to my call on the night of the party. Mrs. Thompson, she said softly, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. A Mr. Michael Denton? He says he's your lawyer. I blinked in. Kemmer, who had been planning this for years. I gripped the edge of my seat, fighting the urge to jump up and shout the truth. But then it was our turn. Evelyn was magnificent, methodically presenting our evidence, dismantling Jonathan's claims one by one. The secret apartment, the hidden bank accounts, the suspicious business dealings, it all came to light. I watched as Jonathan's facade began to crumble. His confident smirk faded, replaced by a look of growing desperation. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke from the heart, my voice steady despite my nerves. I loved my husband, I said, looking directly at the judge. I believed in our marriage, our family. I wasn't looking for a way out. I was blindsided, humiliated, and betrayed. All I'm asking for now is fairness, for myself and for our children. The trial lasted for 3 grueling days. By the end, I was emotionally and physically exhausted. As we awaited the judge's decision, Clara squeezed my hand. Whatever happens, she whispered, I'm proud of you. When the judge finally delivered her verdict, I could hardly believe my ears. Full custody of the children, with Jonathan granted visitation rights. A more than fair division of assets, including the house. And a scathing rebuke of Jonathan's behavior and tactics. It was over. We had won. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Moving back into the house, helping the kids readjust, fielding calls from friends and family who had seen the news reports vindicating me. Jonathan, humbled by the court's decision and the public backlash, retreated from the spotlight. It was a crisp autumn day when I finally felt ready to truly start my new life. The kids were at school, the house was quiet, and I found myself standing in what used to be our bedroom. Jonathan's things were long gone, but there were still echoes of our life together everywhere I looked. With a deep breath, I began to pack away the last remnants of our marriage. Old photos, keepsakes, the little mementos that had once seemed so precious. As I worked, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. This wasn't about erasing the past, it was about making room for the future. Later that afternoon, as I sat on the porch swing watching Emily and Max play in the yard, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Jonathan. Can we talk? It read. In person. Please. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to close that chapter for good. But another part knew that for true closure, this conversation needed to happen. We met at the same cafe where we'd had our confrontation months ago. Jonathan looked different, humbled, tired, but somehow more like the man I'd married than he had in years. Thank you for meeting me, he said as I sat down. I nodded, waiting for him to continue. I owe you an apology, he began, his voice low. Many apologies, actually. What I did, it was unforgivable. I got caught up in my own ego, my own delusions. I convinced myself that I deserved more, that you were holding me back. But I was wrong. So wrong. I listened silently, feeling a complex mix of emotions swirl within me. Losing you, losing our family, it's made me realize what really matters, Jonathan continued. I know I can't undo what I've done. But I want you to know how sorry I am. For everything. For a moment, I was transported back to our life before, the good times, the love we'd shared, the family we'd built. But that life was gone now, shattered by betrayal and lies. I appreciate your apology, I said finally. And for the kids' sake, I hope you mean it. But you're right, you can't undo what's been done. Jonathan nodded, looking pained but resigned. I understand. I hope that someday, you can forgive me. As I left the cafe, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Jonathan's apology couldn't erase the pain he'd caused, but it allowed me to finally let go of the anger I'd been carrying. The future stretched out before me, full of possibilities I hadn't dared to imagine before. I thought about the photography classes I'd signed up for, the volunteer work I'd started at the local women's shelter. For the first time in a long time, I felt excited about what lay ahead. That evening, as I tucked the kids into bed, Emily looked up at me with a small smile. Mom, she said, are we going to be okay? I smoothed her hair back, my heart full of love for my brave, resilient children. Yes, sweetie, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. We're going to be more than okay. As I closed their bedroom door, I paused in the hallway, taking in the quiet of the house, our house. It was different now, filled with new memories, new hopes, new dreams. And that was okay. I made my way to the porch, settling into the swing with a glass of wine. The night was clear, stars twinkling overhead. As I sat there, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The pain, the struggles, the triumphs, they had all shaped me, made me stronger. I raised my glass in a silent toast to freedom, to closure, to new beginnings. The road hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But I was ready for them. Because now I knew the truth, I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. As the gentle night breeze caressed my face, I smiled. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. Port's what they did. I've given my statement to the police, told them everything I know about Diana's behavior over the years. It's not much, but I hope it helps your case. His words hit me like a physical force. Here was someone from Evan's family, someone who had always seemed to be on Diana's side, actively supporting me. It was a small victory, but a significant one. Thank you, Tom, I said softly. That means a lot. As Tom left, I felt a shift inside me. If someone like Tom could see the truth and stand up for what was right, maybe there was hope for change on a broader scale. That conversation with Tom became a turning point. It gave me the push I needed to take my story public. With Mike's guidance and the support of the Allergy Advocacy Group, I decided to speak out about what had happened to me. It started with a local newspaper interview, then expanded to a spot on a regional news channel. Each time I told my story, it became a little easier. I spoke about the years of microaggressions, the constant dismissal of my health concerns, and the ultimate betrayal that had nearly cost me my life. But more than that, I spoke about the broader issues at play. The dangerous misconceptions about food allergies, the lack of understanding about their potentially fatal consequences, and the need for greater education and empathy. My story resonated with people. Soon, I was receiving messages from all over Canada and even internationally. People shared their own experiences of having their allergies dismissed or used against them. Parents of children with allergies thanked me for bringing attention to the issue. As my public profile grew, so did the pressure on the legal case. Diana's lawyers, sensing the shift in public opinion, began pushing for a plea deal. Evan, facing the weight of evidence against him, finally broke down and confessed to his role in the conspiracy. The day of Diana's trial arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. As I walked up, flanked by Lisa and Mike, I caught sight of a group holding signs. For a moment, I feared they were supporters of Diana, but as I got closer, I realized they were from the allergy support group. Their signs read "Allergies are not a joke and justice for Sarah." Inside the courtroom, I sat with Mike, my heart pounding as the proceedings began. Diana sat at the defendant's table, her once immaculate appearance now disheveled, her eyes darting nervously around the room. When her gaze met mine, I saw a flicker of something: regret, fear, before she quickly looked away. As the trial progressed, I listened to testimony after testimony. Medical experts explained the severity of anaphylaxis and the life-threatening nature of my allergies. Friends and family members recounted instances of Diana's dismissive and sometimes hostile attitude towards my dietary restrictions. When it was my turn to take the stand, I felt a calm settle over me. This was my chance to speak my truth, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt dismissed or endangered because of their allergies. I spoke clearly and confidently, recounting not just the events of my birthday party, but the years of subtle and not so subtle aggression that had led up to it. I described the fear I felt as my throat closed up, the betrayal upon learning of Evan's involvement, and the resolve I'd found to fight for justice. As I spoke, I saw members of the jury nodding, some wiping away tears. Even the judge, who had maintained a stoic expression throughout the trial, seemed moved by my testimony. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Diana Thompson, guilty. A collective gasp went through the room. I sat there, stunned, as the judge announced Diana's sentence, 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. It was over. Justice had been served. As we left the courthouse, I was overwhelmed by a mix of emotions: relief, vindication, and a bittersweet sense of closure. The reporters clamored for a statement, but Mike deftly guided me through the crowd to where Lisa was waiting with her car. Once safely inside, Lisa turned to me, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it, Sarah. You stood up for yourself and for so many others. How do you feel?" I took a deep breath, considering the question. Honestly, I feel free. For the first time in years, I feel like I can breathe without looking over my shoulder. But this isn't just about me anymore. There's still so much work to be done. And there was. In the months that followed, I threw myself into advocacy work. I partnered with allergy awareness organizations, spoke at schools and community centers, and even began lobbying for stricter laws regarding food labeling and allergen safety in public spaces. My journey had started with a birthday party gone horribly wrong, but it had led me to a place I never could have imagined. I had found my voice, my purpose, and a community of people dedicated to making the world a safer place for those with allergies. As I stood at the podium of a national allergy awareness conference, preparing to give the keynote speech, I thought back to that scared, gasping woman on her living room floor. She seemed like a different person now, a stranger from another life. "My name is Sarah Thompson," I began, my voice strong and clear. "And this is my story of survival, justice, and the ongoing fight for allergy awareness and respect." The audience applauded, and as I launched into my speech, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The road had been long and painful, but I had emerged stronger, wiser, and ready to make a difference. This wasn't just an ending to my old life, it was the beginning of something far greater than I ever could have imagined.